Part two, organized crime, gangs, and terrorism. Organized crime is defined as crime syndicates that are involved in a multitude of criminal activities, including drug trafficking, gambling, extortion, prostitution, pornography, and fraud. Within the history of organized crime, there's a direct correlation between the development of laws that criminalize a particular type of organized criminal behavior and the expansion of criminal enterprises. The history of organized crime dates back to the early 1900s. The origins of the Italian mafia due to criminalization of drugs and alcohol during the prohibition and temperance movements during that time frame. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act limited the lawful trade of narcotics to doctors and druggists. 5 years later, 1919, the 18th Amendment in the Volstead Act outlawed brewing, distilling, selling, and consumption of alcohol anywhere in the country. So the Prohibition era provided organized crime with the opportunity to flourish and increase their profits through bootlegging operations, speakeasies, and other mechanisms of criminal enterprises. But as the Prohibition era ended, of course, organized crime moved on and found new ventures to profit from. So within the elements and participants in organized crime, it is an enterprise. It's an enterprise crime. So revolving around their illegal activities, they often have legitimate businesses. Organized crime has multiple levels in the most sophisticated organized crime groups. Of course, they use violence and corruption to facilitate their economic interests. They often reach out and have protection from law enforcement, lawyers, and are involved with bankers and accountants to conceal their criminal activities. Within the mafia, most major mafia organizations are led by a boss. He's the leader of the organization, or what's known as a family. He's followed by an underboss. That person is usually second in command of the organization, and potentially will move into the boss position at a later time. The consigliere is the advisor and counselor to the boss. And then the next level is what's known as the captains, or the capo. These are made men, made members of the family, and they lead what's known as a crew of soldiers. The soldier is the lowest level of made member in the family. These are the guys that are earners. They conduct the actual operations of the family. They conduct the criminal activities to earn money that is moved up through the captain and on up through the underboss to the boss of the family. And then finally, an associate is part of a crew, but they're not a made member. And this could be for various reasons. Maybe they're not, in the case of an Italian mafia, they're not Sicilian, of a Sicilian heritage, but they're not a made member for various reasons. Within a drug trafficking organization, or what we call a DTO, you have freelance groups, which are small groupings of individuals. There's no hierarchy, no one leading that particular organization. You have a family business DTO, which is more cohesive. There's clear structure and authority, and there's trust based upon family ties within the group. Communal business DTOs are flexible groups that are bound together by some type of commonality, like ethnicity, religion, nationality, or even their neighborhood. And then a corporation type DTO is a large organization with a formal hierarchy structure and a well-defined division of labor within the organization. Some activities within organized crime, you have racketeering crimes like drugs, gambling, prostitution, and financial crimes. These types of crimes usually involve extortion, by intimidation and violence through fraudulent means and others. Of course, you have drug operations within these racketeering crimes. This involves transportation, packaging, distribution, and sale. And often within these drug operations, you have networks of suppliers, dealers, and even agreements with other organizations. Prostitution is one of the oldest organized crime activities, especially in large cities. What you had early on in organized crime in the United States was this white slave trade, where you had the importation of women from foreign countries. And this was identified as a very serious issue in the United States as early as 1875 with this issue was addressed through legislation like the Page Act and the Immigration Act in 1907. Loan sharking is another racketeering crime within organized crime organizations where money is lent to borrowers at excessively high interest rates, and the return on that loan is enforced by threats, extortion, and violence. And one of the keys to the use of violence in loan sharking is that it is a sign to future borrowers to ensure their repayment of their loans. Bookmaking is the illegal gambling conducted by bookies, and they charge a fee for their services. This is a very productive activity for organized crime groups, and the consequences of not keeping up with your gambling debts are to the gamblers. Money laundering is the use of legitimate businesses or other sources to process the large amounts of money that are earned in these organized crime organizations through their criminal activity. It's estimated that hundreds of billions of dollars are laundered through U.S. businesses in this country. And then once that money is laundered, first through several different entities using small, undetectable amounts of cash. Some typical money laundering operations include car washes, restaurants. Casinos are actually a big source of money laundering. Dirty money comes into the casino, gets washed through slot machines at gambling tables, and then is returned back to the organized crime family as clean money would pass through the casino. Also, some organized crime families use professional money launderers. And once that money is clean, it can be spent, or it can be turned into other types of financial instruments like securities, bonds, and the like. Over the years, some significant laws have been passed to fight organized crime, and probably the most significant is the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970, better known as the RICO statutes. This criminalized illegal activities of organized crime. Of course, the focus of RICO in the 70s was on mafia families in the large cities, specifically New York. But the law was made intentionally flexible and broad to apply to changes in activities of the groups that were involved in organized crime activity. There are 5 essential elements of RICO. Again, they're flexible and broad and open to interpretation. The first element is the unlawful activity involves an enterprise, which is a union or group associated in fact and associated together for a common purpose of engaging in some course of conduct. Number 2 is 2 or more qualifying acts of racketeering activity. The racketeering activity is a violation of certain federal or state criminal statutes like murder, kidnapping, gambling, arson, robbery, on to bribery, extortion, obscenity, narcotics, etc. And the third element is that you show a pattern of this racketeering racketeering activity. The fourth element is that there is some effect upon interstate commerce, meaning it goes state to state. And then fifth is there is a commission of prohibited acts. Under RICO, the prosecutor must show the relationship of the parties or the defendants in the case and the continuous activities, which is their criminal conduct. And the parties show a pattern of conduct. The prosecutor has to show the criminal conduct had an effect on interstate commerce. And this has been loosely determined and defined to be that the defendant need not be physically in the other state where the interstate commerce occurred, and that this criminal conduct can occur either on the telephone, by voice or text, through fax, or on the computer through email, social media, what have you. The prosecutor must show commission of at least one of four specific prohibited acts. These acts are investing income from a pattern of racketeering activity, acquire or maintain an interest in an enterprise through this pattern of racketeering activity, conduct the affairs of an enterprise through the pattern of racketeering activity, or conspire to do any of the above. There are some state versions of RICO, and these are used to prosecute intrastate commerce, criminal activity within the state, within a particular state. There's also been legislation come about where it applies strictly to drug activity. This is known as the continuing criminal enterprise statutes. Again, it applies only to drug activities, and this contains 5 elements as well. That there be a felony violation of any federal narcotics laws, that is part of a continuing series of violations. There's an ongoing pattern. It involves 5 or more persons, and the defendant is an organizer or supervisor within this group, and the defendant obtains substantial income from the drug activity. In terms of CCE violations, the charges can be substantive, meaning the crime itself, the drug law violation itself, and an additional violation of the continuing criminal enterprise statute. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 produced criminal liability for money laundering and gave stiffer penalties for disguising the source of proceeds from unlawful activities or the failure to report income. This act provides for the seizure and forfeiture of cash and property related to any illegal activity. The Bank Fraud Act and Bank Secrecy Act required reporting for financial institutions on large transactions and allowed for government monitoring of bank accounts. The Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 addressed money laundering from the cocaine boom in the 1980s and widespread noncompliance with reporting statutes by banks. There's some criticism of RICO statutes. The law could basically apply to anyone, not only a large-scale criminal organization. It essentially federalized all criminal activity, even those within state jurisdictions. Another criticism is that those that are convicted are punished multiple times for the same offense, which borders on double jeopardy. But the federal courts have upheld convictions due to dual sovereignty, meaning that state prosecution for a substantive offense doesn't bar any federal prosecution for a federal organized crime offense under RICO, and that these applications of RICO are valid as long as one element of the crime is different for each offense. Another substantial criticism, but also one that's utilized to the advantage of law enforcement, is that RICO is vague and there's elements of the statutes that are not clear. But the federal courts have upheld convictions on the premise that an ordinary person would know that these activities by these organizations were criminal and that they were part of an organized crime enterprise. So another area of criminal activity to analyze is the activities of street gangs. Within the structure of a street gang, membership is often determined by a neighborhood or the area where individuals come from. The gang controls the neighborhood or territory, and the members of the gang defend that territory against others. Street gangs are closely knit, they're united, and they look out for each other and each other's problems. The hierarchical structure of a street gang is often determined by the length of time a person has been in the gang, their age, and the family ties within the gang. But leadership positions are often determined by the work that a person has done in furtherance of the gang's activities, or signs that they are dedicated to the gang. Some criminal activities of street gang include drug dealing and distribution, gambling, murder, bank robbery, financial crimes, of course, robbery, extortion, racketeering, and kidnapping. The crack cocaine boom of the 1980s turned these loosely organized gangs of youths in these neighborhoods into highly organized, large-scale organizations. And they've developed specialized distribution methods and networks, both interstate, intrastate, and within other countries as well. There's some notable street gang organizations. The Latin Kings, or first generation Americans or Mexicans, or they're Latin American born. They were created based upon neighborhoods, housing projects, or communities in which they live. The Latin Kings over the years have grown in size and power, and they're very active in prison populations. The Latin gangs, such as the Mexican Mafia, La M, and the Serenos, Nuestra Familia, Norteños, the Latin Kings, MS-13, and the Gulf Cartel are some examples of Latin gangs. Of course, the Crips are designated by the color is blue, one of the largest gangs in the United States, over 30,000 members. And there are over 200 Crip gangs alone in Los Angeles County. The Crips are involved in drug trafficking, murder, assault, auto theft, burglary, extortion, fraud, and robbery. Another notable street gang are the Bloods, characterized by the color red. Over 15,000 members in the United States, 80 plus blood gangs in Los Angeles County alone. And of course, like their rivals, the Crips, they are involved in drug trafficking, murder, assault, auto theft, burglary, extortion, fraud, and robbery as well. Rapid growth in the 1960s was seen amongst the Chinese gangs. They're often smaller in structure, but very hierarchical, 25 to 50 members, including a leader, middle supervisors, and the lower ranks. These Chinese gangs have close relationships with the community. They often invest in legitimate businesses to launder money. They have international connections into Southeast Asia, make large amounts of money from their various criminal enterprises. Vietnamese gangs proliferated in the U.S. after the Vietnam War, primarily in Southern California. They typically are involved in theft rings, robbery, carjacking, and extortion. An extension of street gangs is what's known as prison gangs. Prison gangs offer protection for its members while in prison. They're involved in the illegal contraband trade within prison, things like drug, tobacco, and alcohol within the prison. And they're also involved in murder for hire, hits, assaults, and prostitution in and out of prison. Released members are expected to further the gang's activities once they're on the outside. Some infamous prison gangs include the Aryan Brotherhood, which was formed at San Quentin State Prison in California in the late 60s. The Aryan Brotherhood primarily is involved with white supremacy and self-protection, and came about through interactions with rival gangs, especially Black and Hispanic gangs in the prisons of California. The Mexican Mafia is also heavily involved in prison gang activities. LAME was formed in the 1950s, and they are involved in extortion, drugs, and murder both in and out of prison. There are specific laws to fight street gangs. They're designed to break down and end organized gang syndicates. There's additional penalties for gang members, which prohibit gang members from associating with one another and restricts areas where gang members can gather. Over 12 states have street gang legislation, but the critics claim that these laws violate the Constitution in terms of freedom of association and freedom of expression by its members. Lastly, let's discuss terrorism. There's some specific elements of terrorism that make the crime of terrorism unique to others. The intent within terrorism is that the perpetrators try to ensure that their actions are as devastating as possible. The second element is criminality. This adds a new dimension in that additional stakeholders across law enforcement are involved, and that there are special laws that guide terrorism prevention and response. Terrorism isn't just a United States problem, it's a global problem that's existed for centuries. And there are many definitions, so you have to take a broad view at terrorism when you analyze it. So just think about the expression that one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. The earliest recorded examples of organized terrorism were launched in the 1st century BC by the Sicarii, a religious order. And even look at our early history of the United States and look at things like the Boston Tea Party. Could that be considered terrorism under our present definitions? Terrorists have a wide range of weapons and tactics to use and to choose from. They have traditional methods like shootings, bombings, and assault type attacks, but also weapons of mass destruction, things like chemical weapons, biological and radiological weapons, and even the use of cyber terrorism. The US has faced terrorism since its founding. Hundreds of attacks globally and within our country. Bombings, shootings, and biological attacks, physical assaults, and more. The terrorism hazard is broad in scope. It's perpetuated by people and organizations with a broad range of types, sizes, and backgrounds. Many may have or may not have a tangible ideological or philosophical reason for carrying out their attacks. The attacks can be carried out by a group or by individuals. They can be carried out by domestic or homegrown terrorists or by an internationally based terrorist organization. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences, things like political, religious, social, racial, or environmental issues. Groups like the KKK, anarchists, labor unions, the Black Panthers, Weather Underground, Army of God, Eastern Liberation Front, and others. Or lone wolf terrorists like George Montesky, Sam Melville and Jane Alpert, Maureen Gorbagovich, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and of course, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who bombed the Oklahoma City federal building. The FBI defines international terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups who are inspired by or associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization or nations, which means that they are a state sponsor of terrorism. Groups include Hamas, Hezbollah, the PLO, of course, Al Qaeda, Islamic Jihad Union, ISIS or ISIL, and other groups. As of today, 4 nations are regarded by the United States government as state sponsors of terrorism, and they are Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba as recently as 2021. There's a series of watershed terror attacks affecting the United States prior to 9/11. In 1983, the Khobar Towers bombing occurred, in which Iranian intelligence, Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Saudi Shia bombed a United States military facility in Saudi Arabia. The World Trade Center bombing in 1993 carried out by Yamzi Rousseff. The Alfred P. Murrow Federal Building bombing in 1995, of course, carried out by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. The Kenya and Tanzania embassy bombings, referred to as the East Embassy bombings, East Africa Embassy bombings in 1998, were carried out by Al Qaeda. And this placed Osama bin Laden on the United States government's terrorism radar. And in 2000, the USS Cole bombing in Yemen was also carried out by Al Qaeda. Following 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 in the United States, a series of legislation was passed to enhance the nation's counterterrorism activities. The first being the USA Patriot Act. This was passed in 2001 with very little congressional deliberation and signed by President Bush in October of that year. This granted exceptional powers to investigate suspected terrorism. The most important provisions of the law include the promotion of information sharing between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It made it illegal to knowingly harbor terrorists, increased the nation's wiretap powers, gave the nation greater power to detain non-US citizens, and greatly increased the US and Canada border protection efforts, increased financial reporting requirements, and increased or eliminated the statute of limitation on most terrorist attacks. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 was signed by President Bush in November of that year. The intent was to shore up weaknesses and ensure response and recovery connected with prevention and preparedness. We're all interconnected in our counterterrorism activities. The Homeland Security Act established the Homeland Security Council and the Office for State and Local Coordination and Preparedness. And probably most significantly, it created the Department of Homeland Security and gave that agency cabinet level status. This was a massive organizational change, probably none seen since post-World War II, when President Truman created the Department of Defense. This organizational change affected almost 200,000 federal employees that were working in 22 previously existing agencies. All these people were transferred under the authority of the new Department of Homeland Security. A mechanism exists to fight terrorism known as the International Criminal Court. This was established and governed and has been governed by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1998. The ICC investigates and tries individuals charged with the gravest of crimes to the international community. The ICC has jurisdictions over 4 types of crime: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. As of now, 123 countries or state parties are members of the ICC. But currently, the United States is not a state party. They have signed the Rome Statute, but have not ratified the treaty in Congress. The criminal justice system is used as a counterterrorism tool. Based out of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, known as Gitmo, the US government has detained terrorist captives since 2002. At some point in time, there were over 780 detainees, but less than 40 remain at Gitmo. Of course, the detention camp has gone through significant criticisms, including indefinite detention periods without trial and other due process violations, violations of Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war, including torture and general inhumane treatment. There's reports of violent interrogation, lack of medical care for detainees, and the detainment of civilians that weren't engaged in terrorist activity. At Gitmo, there's been this process known as combatant status review tribunals. These are proceedings to determine if Gitmo detainees were actually enemy combatants and to provide a process for the detainees to contest this designation. By definition, an enemy combatant is anyone who engages with the other side in an armed conflict. They are usually members of the armed forces of the state in which another state is at war. In this module, you learn to list the elements of the crime of perjury, define the crime of obstruction of justice and the crimes within its scope, explain the laws used by the American criminal justice system to combat organized crime, and identify the criminal activities conducted by street gangs. And then finally, you learn to describe the difference between terrorism and other crimes.